I'm going to start recording now. Today we are having a special panel of design and implementation block grant funding program administrators from Mount Ascutney Regional Commission, Vermont Association of Conservation Districts, and Watersheds United Vermont. We also have sub-grantee project highlights from Connecticut River Conservancy, Friends of the Winooski River, and Franklin County Natural Resources Conservation District. This presentation will highlight some of the amazing work that all of these organizations do to protect clean water in Vermont. Quick mention of our upcoming lecture. Thursday, June 8th, our next conversation will focus on efforts to expand Vermont's mud puppy population. I'll put a link in the chat to the Clean Water Conversation series webpage where you can sign up and view today's slides. This lecture will feature an introduction by Gianna Petito, our Clean Water Initiative Grants Supervisor and Technical Project Manager for the block grant, sub-grantee project highlights, and some questions for our funding program administrators about the grantee experience. At the end of the panel, if there's time, we will answer any audience questions that come up. Automatic captions are available under the 3 dots you'll see on your screen. This lecture is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel after the event. Now I'll turn it over to Gianna to give an introduction about the block grant and introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. And I'm going to press present in Teams. Here we go. So thank you so much, Rachel, for coordinating the Clean Water Conversation series. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. And thank you so much to our great suite of presenters and panelists. I am Gianna Petito, the Grant Supervisor for the Clean Water Initiative Program, also the Technical Project Manager for the Design Implementation Block Grant, which we'll be chatting about today, which basically just means I'm the liaison between our funding program administrators and the Department of Environmental Conservation. So to take a quick step back for folks who are unfamiliar, who is CWIP, the Clean Water Initiative Program? Our mission statement of our program is here on the slide over on the left. We are part of the government alphabet soup. We're in the Water Investment Division in the Department of Environmental Conservation in the Agency of Natural Resources. And the purpose and intent of the Clean Water Initiative also does exist in state statute. So we have that down at the bottom left. One of the purposes being to provide the financing necessary to achieve and maintain compliance with Vermont's water quality standards. So how do we do that as a program? We achieve the intent and purpose by managing grant programs for what we call clean water projects. And that's sort of a broad term to encompass a whole bunch of great work that folks do on the ground to help protect and restore our water quality. You could think of it across different sectors, stormwatery kind of projects that capture road runoff or runoff from parking lots, to dam removals, which have water quality benefits, to projects that allow our rivers to access their floodplains. All of these are things that we help fund. We also create our funding in sort of different project stages. We provide funding for what we call assessment and clean water project identification to go out on the landscape and look at these water systems and find opportunities. We fund what we call project development to take those opportunities and talk to the landowners, talk to the permitting staff, figure out what is the feasibility to really get these projects launched and off the ground. We fund design work, maybe preliminary design, little concepts drawings, all the way through final design that might be stamped by a formal engineer and have permit review associated with it. We fund the installation of these projects, the ground and earth moving. And then sometimes we fund for certain programs the maintenance and follow-up of these projects to ensure they continue to operate. So when we're talking about the design implementation block grant, we're talking about funding going towards these phases, this design work of the project and then the implementation work. But I highlight this slide to show that a lot of our partners are doing a lot of other work to get these projects to fruition and to continue to operate past implementation. And so there's a lot of great work happening, and we're really just sort of talking about one slice of that clean water life cycle. And then the other piece of context for folks who might be unfamiliar, what is a block grant? Historically, the Clean Water Initiative program funded a lot of individual projects, kind of what looks like line A on this image. We have project implementers and managers that were doing all the work for the projects, and we were individually granting funds out to them. But as our program has grown, we have relied more so on this line B, an intermediary called a funding program administrator. So that is our suite of panelists today. These are the entities that now put out calls for proposals, review projects, select and directly oversee the project work, and report back to us. And we have close relationships with them in terms of providing them guidance on what should be eligible, how funds should be prioritized. And that's what today's structure is going to be talking about. So talking about the design implementation block grant, just to give you folks a quick snapshot, this rendition of the block grant is launched in August 2019. So for a little perspective, that is before COVID pandemic hit the world. It is closing December 2024. So it will be open for about 5.5 years. In that time frame, it's going to have received just shy of $10 million in funding. And the partners have brought local, federal, non-state leverage to the table in the tune of 1.3 million, in addition to the 9.7 we've put into this block grant. The funding program administrators collectively have funded roughly 196 projects. And the pie chart over on the right shows what project phases have been funded. Largely the final design phases, that's about half of the funding, half of the projects funded have been final design phase projects. About a third of them have been implementation projects. And then a smaller sliver, as you can see, have been that preliminary design phase of project work. And then in terms of achievements, these projects are still ongoing and some have only just been funded. So we've only received about 20% or a fifth of these projects closed out final reporting. Of those, though, 26 designs have been completed, 11 acres of floodplain restored, 670 linear feet of lakeshore restored, 40 acres of impervious surface treated with stormwater practices, and roughly 300 kilograms of phosphorus reduced. So this is just a small sliver of achievements from a small sliver of implementation projects. And so I really congratulate all the partners that have been doing this great work. So hopefully that is enough context for you all about who we're talking with today. And so I'll do a quick introduction. I invite the presenters to just put on your cameras so you can do a quick little wave. So for the funding program administrators today, we have Chris Yurek from the Mount Ascutney Regional Commission. From the, hi Chris, thank you. From the, our funding program administrator is the Natural Resource Conservation Council, but we also have great staff from the Vermont Association of Conservation Districts that helps that funding get on the ground. And so from VACD, we have Jill Arachi. Thank you, Jill. And then from Watersheds United Vermont, we have both Lynn Munno, if you can wave, and Christian Pelletier. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Thank you. And then also with us today that will be presenting briefly are two project implementers and some of the projects that they've been doing on the ground. So we have from the Connecticut River Conservancy, Kathy Urfer. Thank you. And Friends of the Winooski River, Michelle Braun. So thank you all so much for your time today. And with that, I'll pass it back to Rachel.
Thank you, Gianna. So now we're going to hear from some of the projects from the sub-grantees. And first, we're going to hear from the Connecticut River Conservancy. We have Kathy Urfer here. Would you like to give your project highlight first?
Sure, that's fine. Thanks. So this project, interestingly, actually accessed the block grant funding twice, once for the design, the final design, and then again for implementation. And just briefly, I'll explain the top two pictures here. This was a berm removal project along the Green River, and this is the Green River in southeastern Vermont. In the towns of, runs through the towns of Halifax and Guilford. And you can see, you're essentially looking downriver at the berm. So you can see floodplain on the left, and you can see the river on the right. Both of these shots are before shots. So you can see the height of the berm. It goes quite a ways down, and it was probably like 3 to 5 feet. And then the picture at the bottom, I particularly wanted to show this because as you walk the berm, you could see that there were trees that had started growing there in the riparian area before the berm was put on them. And this berm was really a result of Tropical Storm Irene. The Tropical Storm Irene came up, flooded this entire area, brought all kinds of stones, boulders, dirt, sediment onto this floodplain, and the farmer, it's a hayfield, the farmer pushed it all back and bermed it up against the river. So the project was to remove the berm. I'm guessing you have another slide with some of the after photos. Yeah, and you can see here that photo in the top right is the same view looking down with the berm removed, and those mature trees were the ones that were in place. So our contractor actually was very careful to work around and pull the sediment and stuff out from around these already existing trees. And then in the left, in that top right photo, you can also see the young trees that we planted. So after the berm came out, there we planted a 35-foot buffer along the entire length. And then also ended up needing to do some knotweed treatment at the end. So benefits for clean water: provided floodplain access for sediment attenuation on the floodplain. This was designed for a 10-year storm and above. So anytime we get a larger storm, it'll flood up into this 10-acre parcel, drop sediment up there, and then it also will then reduce flooding and additional erosion downstream. And the design cost was around $9,000. Implementation costs were around $39,000.
Thanks for that overview, Kathy. Next, we'll transition to Friends of the Winooski River. Michelle Braun will be presenting about the stormwater project.
Okay, so this project started in 2015, a few years before I joined the organization, but it just finished, just went to construction in 2021, because sometimes these things are slow. So Berry City, you may have heard, is subject to landslides and gullying, and Berry Town sits up above Berry City and has steep slopes, highly erodible soil, low infiltration potential soil. So even moderate development in that area has a significant impact on Berry City. You can see in the photo that is shown on the right, there's a large blue drainage areas. Berry City is at the top where that little red X is. It's top of the photo, bottom of the hill. And in the photo on the left, you can see on the right-hand side is the recreation complex. A lot of playing fields. What you can't see out of the picture are tennis courts and basketball courts. At some point in the 90s, they did dig a swale to try to manage the runoff from those paved courts. But the swale just concentrated the flow and formed a really big gully at the outlet. Can we change slides? There we go. There's the gully at the outlet. You can see people are throwing trash down there. On the right-hand side, you can see, mature hemlocks falling in. It was really quite a large gully. So this is an overview. The big circle in the middle is because this is a cemetery, and so that's a sort of a drive around. So we had to do this project in the corner of the cemetery, which was quite something because it's owned by the Catholic Diocese in Burlington. So we had to work quite a bit with them to get permission. But you can see in the left side, we did an improved swale, widened the swale and installed check dams to slow down the flow there, and then installed a bioretention basin with an outlet to a stone apron spreader to prevent the kind of erosion that we're seeing. And then the gully is off to the end, and it was stabilized. Next slide. So you can, this is the overview, essentially the swale, the basin, the apron spreader, and then on the left is the gully. Next slide. So these are all photos that I just took last week, 2 years after construction. On the upper left is the swale, and you can see the fencing at the far end surrounding the basin. There were killdeer nesting in these check dams, which was kind of fun. They were not happy I was there. Then there's the bioretention basin in the upper right corner. In the lower left, you see that stone apron spreader, and in the lower right is the stabilized gully. So we had ecological restoration program grants to do the design work for these, which was done by Watershed Consulting Associates. The overall cost of the project, then we had implementation funds from Watersheds United Vermont. And the grant from Watersheds United Vermont was $148,000. The phosphorus reduction was just under 8 pounds per year. So it came out to more than $16,000 per pound. Not the most efficient project ever, but decent anyway. So there you go.
Thanks, Michelle. So for our last project highlight, Jill Arachi is standing in to describe a project implemented by the Franklin County Natural Resources Conservation District at Lake Carmi.
Thanks. So I think you've all heard of Lake Carmi. It's our lake in crisis, impaired for phosphorus. There's been a lot of money invested in trying to clean it up for both efforts, both large and small. And this is one of the smaller ones, a project implemented by the Franklin County Natural Resources Conservation District and funded by NRCC. Feel free just to go slowly through these slides, Rachel. But I wanted to note that the lake-wise assessment was actually done by a watershed group, the Franklin Watershed Committee, which is the homeowners association basically around the lake. So it was a collaboration between the district and the watershed group, and the district ended up doing the design, getting the funding for the design and implementation. And I'm just going to read through a little blurb that Lauren Weston, the district manager of Franklin District, wrote. And she also is an engineer. She designed this project. So this past April, Franklin Natural Resources Conservation District, and you can just advance these slides while I'm babbling, completed a lakeshore bioengineering project at a camp on the north end of Lake Carmi in Franklin, Vermont. This project had received permits from Vermont DEC Lakes and Ponds for this clean water project to help restore shoreline and improve water quality in Lake Carmi, Vermont's only lake in crisis. In December, the contractor was HFM Services, LLC, worked with the district on the project to remove 2 small concrete blocks that were armoring the lake shore of a camp. The concrete blocks were at risk of failing and falling into the lake, leaving loose, bare soil behind them, vulnerable to the lake's potential erosive energy. The blocks were safely and carefully removed and brought to a concrete recycling location. Following removal, the 2 areas where the blocks had been were stabilized using encapsulated soil lifts and stone toes, techniques in the Vermont Bioengineering Manual. This involved using angular stone at the bottom of the slope between the lake and the lawn to dissipate energy, and then placing erosion fabric from the lawn down towards the shoreline, installing a choir log at the end closest to the lake, and placing 1 foot of soil on top of the fabric, and then rolling the erosion fabric back on top of the soil. This was done twice to achieve the needed height of the shoreline. Through the skill and care of the contractor, a cedar tree that had been growing through one of the concrete blocks was maintained and undamaged following construction. The soil lifts were built around the tree in order to support it and keep it in place. Once this earth-moving work was complete, the site was left to survive the potential damage from winter ice and energy from Lake Carmi, which can be strong at the north end of the lake due to regular wind flows. In this past April, Franklin District returned to the site to find the bioengineering practices had held up perfectly to the winter weather, and the soil lifts were ready to be planted. Using native shrubs that attract pollinators and other wildlife, Franklin County District cut small holes into the erosion fabric and planted shrubs into the soil inside of the lifts. Live stakes of willows, alders, and dogwoods were also installed along the shoreline to help stabilize the shoreline. The hope is that these plants will grow roots that will help stabilize the shoreline from erosion in place of the previous concrete blocks. They will also create shade in a small area of the lake and contribute falling leaves for healthy fish habitat. The camp owners and Franklin County District are very happy with the project and the restored shoreline. The district hopes to be able to continue many more projects like this with other landowners across Franklin County in the coming years. The total project cost was just over $25,000 for design and implementation.
Thank you, Jill. So next, we're going to transition to our questions for the funding program administrators. The first question is, were there any parts of the process that went particularly well? And I'll leave that to any of you to jump in and tell and share.
I'm happy to start. I'm Lynn Munno, Director of Watersheds United Vermont, and just first wanting to just say we are really appreciative that we've had the opportunity to help fund these clean water projects, and feel that we've kind of tried to put a WOV touch on the work and support our sub-grantees as much as possible. As I think a few people have stated, like they're the ones actually, as you could just hear, out there actually doing the work on the ground, and also work to responsibly utilize state funds to support high quality projects. So a few specific things, and you'll hear from me and you'll hear from Christian on some of the other questions. We work together to administer these the design and implementation block grant funds, but a few specific things that we feel like went well. One is the way that we've approached our project review process, and through time really feel like we've developed a project review committee where we pull together folks who have expertise on both stormwater projects and or natural resource projects, to have them review the project proposals and score projects, but then also bring those folks together for a project review committee meeting where we value the scores and the work that they put into that aspect, but even more importantly, we want to hear their feedback, and we thoroughly discuss each project to get any feedback, comments, concerns that they may have. Which then gets us to the second part that I feel like has gone really well, which is the importance of developing that relationship between us and the sub-grantees, and really having an iterative process as much as possible. So being able to, if we feel that a project is a high quality project and we're able to fund it, working through some of those questions and comments that come up to help build the, provide feedback for the best projects possible, while of course giving autonomy to the sub-grantees to do their project and their project work. And also just making sure that Christian and I are here throughout the process, from application through the project, through the final deliverables, to answer any questions that may come up, any changes that may happen. So that's been an important part of the project, is just recognizing our sub-grantees as the ones who are out there getting the work done. And just two other really quick things. One is that we've developed a good relationship with the other funding program administrators, the other block grant holders, so the conservation districts and the Mount Ascutney Regional Commission. We work together to share our materials, our review processes. We sit on each other's review committees often. We share projects back and forth. If we are out of funding for a specific round, projects get passed back and forth. And we've learned from each other as we've all been growing this process. So that's been a really great aspect of this work. And then lastly, a really great part has been our partnership with DEC, with the Department of Environmental Conservation, and specifically with Gianna, who's been our program manager for this grant, always willing to answer questions and work through challenges we may be having. And then also the watershed planners and the other DEC technical staff. We couldn't do this work without their support either.
Thanks, Lynn. Does anybody else want to share on the first question?
I can. And all of mine are great things that DEC did. So it's nice and complementary to what Lynn has highlighted. I wanted to highlight two particular documents that DEC prepared that have proven very useful. One is the Project Readiness and Eligibility Screening Form. So this is a form that grantees can use to determine whether they are eligible, whether the project is eligible, and what types of consultation they need to have with different DEC departments and watershed planners. We find that tool very helpful, especially since I'm not a technical person, right? So I feel reassured that they're actually going through a process and checking with all these different departments when I review that form. So basically we took that form and we integrated it into our application process. There's another document called the Project Types Table, which defines every project and discusses what the standards for implementation are and what the deliverables and outcomes of that implementation are expected to be. And we also find this document very helpful, and I'll explain how a little later. And then I would like to also shout out that DEC has recently shifted a policy allowing us to use their funds as match on federal grants. And this is very important because many of these projects are very complex and involve multiple funding sources, including federal funds that usually require match. So we're grateful for that flexibility. That's it for me.
Thank you. Unless there are any more comments, we can move on to our second question, which is what are some challenges or lessons learned from the DIVG experience?
I'm happy to jump in. This is Christian from WOV again. And I think this kind of dovetails nicely with what Lynn and Jill said. A lot of the strengths from this program also led to some challenges and lessons learned. And one of the things I want to talk about is how WOV's application process has evolved over the course of this block grant program. And when I look at evaluating projects on the highest level, we kind of look at two things: the eligibility, and then the merits, the water quality merits that we use to evaluate projects. And originally, when WOV created a process for looking at projects, we had a two-step process that first had our applicants fill out a eligibility form, and then after that, they would fill out a full application. And this was great to catch projects that may not be eligible, which would save the sub-grantees time from filling out a full application, but it also created a really long process and a lengthy process to award grants. And so that was a big challenge to us. We realized that it was too long of a time frame that we were creating for these applications. And so we streamlined it. And part of what Jill was talking about, we had a great new project readiness and eligibility document that we tied into our application. So it could be just one application and document that was submitted at the same time. And at the same time, WOV also developed a bunch of resources for our sub-grantees, like grant guidelines, and had trainings. So that challenge from having a longer timeline to get projects out the door ended up being a lesson learned to have a more streamlined application. And why having a streamlined application that gets all the right information from a subgrantee is important is because of the next challenge that we saw, and that's that projects are all unique and complicated. And that's not a bad thing. It's just the reality that projects are created to address an issue. They're not created to fit perfectly into a funding structure. And so we found that almost every different issue or problem that we kind of dreamed up that could happen to a project has happened, because they're complicated and there's a lot of different factors going into a project. And so it's been really important to us to be able to create an application that can get us all the information we need to make a decision on how to fund a project, but also not be overly burdensome for the applicant. And then also kind of building on what Jill said, there's a great milestones and deliverables table. And one of the challenges was making sure that our subgrantees understand that and then could translate that table to physically getting us deliverables. So a big challenge has been creating a reporting infrastructure that allows subgrantees to know exactly what they need to provide to WUV to complete a project and the reporting for a project. And so we've gone through a few different iterations and ended up on a folder system that I think works fairly well. And then just two other challenges I wanted to quickly note. One, that there's a bunch of different project types that we fund as part of these block grants, and each funding program administrator has different areas of expertise. And so for WUV, it's been a big challenge to kind of branch out from the projects and the groups that we know to find different projects that fit into this funding. And one that comes to mind is forestry projects wasn't exactly up our alley. And so we've had to make different connections to get good projects and different project types. And then the last challenge that we've had is continual challenges to make sure that these are cost reimbursable grants and making sure that we can turn around funds to our grantees as fast as possible so they can get those payments out to their subcontractors. And that's been a challenge, and we've had to adjust, but it's been great working with DEC to streamline processes to make sure that we can reimburse projects in a timely manner. Thanks.
Thanks, Christian. Are there any other comments about this question? Jill?
Yes, sorry, there's a phone ringing in the background. I unplugged my really noisy phone. So some of the challenges are behind us. I'd say staffing shortages at both DC and our organization created delays that were damaging to our programming, right? Delays in getting grant agreements and having RFPs and getting payments. And it created delays that might have meant missing a construction season or a bit of damage to a relationship, and disappointments and missed project opportunities. But thankfully, we seem to be beyond that. I just want to acknowledge a lot of work has gone to clean all that up. So lesson learned, make sure you have enough resources in your own staff to manage the program. My second point is just be aware of the timing and seasonality of the work. It's very seasonal, and make sure that we adjust our grant rounds accordingly. If we had a grant round at the wrong time of year, it meant, delaying implementation it could mean a whole season if it's an implementation project. So make sure that especially supporting implementation grants is done timely enough for the sub-grantee to actually then go out to bid and have contractors and that kind of thing. And then I wanted to mention the impacts of price increases during COVID. It meant that a lot of our projects, if implementation was delayed, the costs were no longer accurately reflected in the grant budget. So we've sort of shifted to an approach of, if there's a design and implementation project, of splitting them and saying, do the design, then go out to bid, and then give us your budget for the implementation project, so that we don't get budgets that end up being meaningless and then we have to go back and reconsider the budget anyway. So that has worked pretty well, but we had some projects that came back for $30,000 more than they were originally approved for. Those are my comments on that question.
Thanks, Jill. So yes, we have lost Chris. And we're trying to get him back online, but in the meantime, we can move on to the third question. Do the FPAs have any recommendations to future block grant holders on best practices?
We can start again. I'm going to take a couple of these and then pass it along to Christian. And I'm sorry not to have Chris's voice on here, and hopefully he'll come on and answer all three questions at once. But the first thing, as Christian and I were talking about through this, is thinking about, we really always keep in mind that our project implementers are our partners. And we treat them as such, which doesn't mean we always get everything right, but that we try to refine our processes as much as possible to meet the needs of the project implementers. And we obviously competitively evaluate projects, and we only fund high quality projects. And we can do that while we are making sure to keep in mind that these project implementers are our partners in achieving clean water. And so by that, we think of ourselves really as the funders of these projects. These aren't our projects, we're the funders. And so we're pleased to play a role and help as much as possible getting these projects on the ground, but remembering that the project implementers are doing the heavy lifting and doing all of that. These are, for the most part, well, I should say, for the most part, these are voluntary projects that are on private land. And so we know that it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort to get these projects, to work with landowners and get these projects to fruition. And so our job, we really see our job as trying to make it as easy as possible for our great partners to do their work. So that's kind of just a thought. It's like looking forward, it's like thinking about like how we can be of service in this process. And then, as I mentioned before, working collaboratively with other funding program administrators. So with other block grant holders, and as that's kind of increasing, as we're looking out to the now having clean water service providers as funding program administrators as well, making sure that we're all collaboratively working together and trying as much as possible to find sort of the right funding for these great projects, which means, having communication among ourselves. So I've been really, again, appreciative of working with the conservation districts and with the Mount Ascutney Regional Commission, and look forward to, working more broadly across our broad range of funding program administrators moving forward. And I think Christian just had a couple other things to add.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. I wanted to highlight one of my biggest recommendations to funding program administrators or subgrantees who are interested in these programs is to understand the funding policy as best as they can. And so these grants, mostly right now, we're looking at the 2021 QIP funding policy, but there's also the newer 2023 funding policy. And knowing this as an FPA is really crucial in being able to quickly address any questions on eligibility or understanding how we need to evaluate and rank projects. And so fully understanding that as the FPA is super important. And then understanding that your subgrantees might not be as comfortable with that document as you are. So we look at it as our job to distill the most important information from the funding policy into documents that our subgrantees can use. And so for us, that looks like creating guidance documents and in our application to build in checks to make sure that our subgrantees are looking at the funding policy. So we'll have questions like, yes or no, have you reviewed the funding policy? Or from the funding policy, what are the performance metrics for this project? And so that's been really crucial and definitely a best practice that I'd recommend to any FPA. And then with that, I think we've seen one of the most important things. I'm going to hit at the milestones and deliverables table again. That's been kind of the heart of this program. If an applicant can understand the milestones and deliverables for a project, it makes the process a lot easier for them. And those milestones and deliverables tables used to be in the funding policy, but now they've been broken out into their own form. And so it's important for an FPA to kind of put those milestones and deliverables tables in as many places as possible to make sure that the sub-grantee can see it. So it's in our guidance documents, we mentioned in our application, they show up in our grant agreements. So that'd be a best practice to make sure that the applicants understand those tables as best as possible. Thanks.
I will echo Chris in my first comment, which is use the tools that DEC has provided and make them accessible to your subgrantees. And, you know, DEC is complicated, and you might think you're doing a simple project, and then you find out there's a lot of requirements. So it's really great to have tools to make sure the subgrantees can work their way through requirements of permitting and consultation. What we did is we took that milestones and deliverables table and we created checklists for every project type. And it helps both us as the administrator and the grantee to know you're going to be required to submit this or that. And in some cases, some of those items are already submitted as part of their application. So then we keep sort of a running checklist. And when we go to close out the grant, we can actually send them that checklist and say, here's your checklist, here's what you've submitted. And so that's been a great tool for us to make sure, you know, we include that in their grant agreement, and we include it in trainings to make sure they're aware of what the reporting requirements are going to be. Grantees don't like to find out after they've signed a grant agreement or near the end of the project what the reporting requirements are going to be. We really need to make sure they understand them up front, which takes effort sometimes. My second point was to consider the way that you build relationships and partnerships, as Lynn has highlighted with your subgrantees. I recommend, you know, considering the continuum of different types of block grants, which Gianna highlighted at the beginning. There's project development block grants, there's assessment block grants, there's some monitoring and evaluation block grants going on, and help them and support them in the way we communicate with them in supporting continuity of implementation through the various stages of a project. So as I mentioned, in our last round, we actually approved some designs and said, we'll approve your implementation. We approve the project. We don't approve the budget yet. So finish your design. We're going to set some money aside, you know, in our budget for your implementation, but you need to come and resubmit after the design, because a lot happens. But, you know, once you've done the design, you learn a lot. So we're supporting them and not having to go through quite as many formal application processes. And it makes sense for us. It makes sense for them. It increases efficiency in terms of expediting workload and avoiding duplication of paperwork. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Jill. So it seems like Chris Yurek is still having trouble getting into the meeting for some technical reason. So we might not be able to get answers from him. Hopefully he can join us a little bit later on, but we're going to have to move on now. Thank you for everybody's thoughtful answers. I will actually, because Chris wasn't able to answer these questions, I'm going to follow up with him and get his answers in writing and include them in the follow-up email that I'll send out. So we will be able to hear from him at one point later on. But with our remaining time, let's answer some audience questions if there are any. And if you're in the audience and have questions, you can put your question in the chat, or you can raise your hand using the raise hand feature, and we'll unmute you and you can speak. Okay, here's a question from the chat. In the 196 funded projects, do we know how many dam removal projects were funded?
I think we do. I think the answer is 0, but correct me if I'm wrong here. Dam removal projects are ineligible for design implementation block grant funding, Todd. We actually have a separate block grant for that. But I don't know if the eligibility might have changed over time, so please correct me, block funding program administrators.
Yeah, that's correct. And the dam removals are not eligible under design and implementation block grant. I think they used to be direct grants through DEC, and now there's the dam removal design and implementation block grant that WUV administers, and we have funded 13 dam removal design and implementation projects thus far through that grant.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry if you alluded to this while I was doing some tech difficulties with Chris, but I'm curious for those on the line, what is maybe the most surprising thing you learned about project work? Either an interesting question that came up or, yeah, an interesting thing you learned about how projects are going on these days or with these challenges.
One thing I'd like to mention, and I learned it in a surprising way through a friend that was looking to implement a project, that the relationship with the landowner is very sensitive. So the landowner who's accepting the project and maybe contributing funding to the project and maybe giving up land for the project to some degree, or giving up something in order to gain something for natural resources. That relationship is very sensitive, and the way that we support our subgrantees is very important in helping that nurture that relationship with the landowner. We have to be aware that the subgrantee is in a very sensitive role vis-a-vis the landowner when they're marketing a particular practice or project. And, landowners generally expect things to happen faster than we do. And we want to be really clear. We try to be diplomatic and clear in what we explain to them, and that this may take some time and those kinds of things, and also to explain the reasons for things. But I think I just want to highlight that. A friend of mine was like, telling me his perception of things. I'm like, wow, I need to remember that point.
And maybe building on that, it gets to what Christian was saying earlier, that that all projects are unique and complicated. I mean, every once in a while, a straightforward project will come through, but usually it's complicated. These are, when you're looking at as Jill was just saying, working with private landowners, the complexities of getting projects done in the right way. So it takes a lot of, I guess it's science and creativity in order to get these projects done. And it's also, when I was saying earlier, like that we are the funders, we're often not the only funders on a project. Often these projects are leveraging significant other dollars. So that's something good for us to keep in mind as well. And that those different funders have different milestones and deliverables and requirements, and that the project implementers are juggling all of those different aspects of a project in order to bring it to fruition.
Emily, do you have a question?
Yeah, maybe just following up on the landowner dynamic. Kathy, I appreciate the project example you shared, and I was wondering if you could share a little bit more insight on how you got the landowner in that particular case to have buy-in on the berm removal project. It looked like there was a hayfield and some buffer planting that occurred maybe within what had previously been harvestable. So was just curious if you had any insights or lessons learned to share from that experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what Lynn said, like every property owner is totally different. In this case, the landowner was not the person haying the field. He, essentially, like, there was a neighbor, a local person who was haying the field. And we have run into this a lot where there may be agricultural land being used, and it's not necessarily the landowner that's doing it. They're allowing someone to use the land. So he had to have a conversation with that person haying the field to make sure that, we understood what that person's needs were, and also so that the farmer haying the field knew to be careful, like once the riparian buffer was established, right? The other thing kind of interesting about this project was this was an older gentleman. His son had planted a bunch of buckthorn trees that he was trying to like nurture and recover. And so some of them were in the berm. And so we actually, our contractor was very careful to bucket load those trees out, put them aside as they were clearing the berm. And then we replanted those trees and flagged them for him. So, landowners have very close and intimate relationships with their land. They like certain plants. They're excited, they may be excited about birds. They may be excited about different kinds of animals. So in all cases, it's sort of trying to figure out like what would serve this person sort of on a personal level. And so for this project, it was definitely taking care of those buckthorns that, his son was nurturing. It was also considerations of like, well, if we have a suite of plants we can choose from, like, are there particular trees you like better than others, and just making sure that we're kind of like serving the landowner in that way. I think a lot of it is relationship building and also just education. I mean, in this case, it's like you end up having the opportunity to really bring someone into understanding how rivers work and then developing a long-term relationship with them as a steward of the river.
Thank you, Kathy. That's amazing.
Darlene, I saw you raising your hand. I'm not sure if you still had a question you wanted to share. Oh, but you are muted. Do you see a microphone button to press? You can try to unmute too.
There, now can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Maybe this is offbeat at this time, but I was wondering about non-regulated projects. I mean, I think that some of these processes that you're going through for the permitting really look like they'd be helpful as they're even looking at non-regulated projects. And I don't know if you would agree with that, or or will they be necessary for those that would be dealing with the non-regulated ones? That was my question. I mean, I was just curious.
That's a great question, Darlene. I invite others to join in on this. This is something I'm always struggling to clarify, and I'm not the expert in this realm too, but there's two pieces that we talk about when we talk about regulation. One are projects that are required to be done because of regulation. So we have, for example, a stormwater general permit that for properties that have more than 3 acres of impervious surface, they have to retrofit those areas and treat that stormwater. So those projects we consider a regulatory project because they're being driven or compelled by a rule. Or if an organization, unfortunately puts a parking lot over a wetland, right? They have to then go do a restoration project or remove that, and that would be driven by regulation. The other thing is all projects, whether they're being driven by regulation or voluntary, also have to meet some permit requirements. So even if it's a voluntary project, if it's going to have any impacts on the stream bank, that project might still need a stream alteration permit. Or if it's going to be near a wetland, that project, even though it's voluntary, might still need the wetlands program to do a delineation. So some of the screening forms that were referenced earlier help. The majority of these projects were non-regulatory or voluntary projects, but we sort of handhold them or try to help people who are advancing these projects understand who to talk to in all the permitting programs to make sure that these voluntary projects are still meeting the required permitting pieces. Does that help make a distinction there? Great.
Yes, that does help a lot because, yeah.
Yeah, and I know we use regulatory and non-regulatory so quickly that that
Yeah.
distinction sometimes is not clear.
If you just want to kind of to expand a floodplain, or just make it easier for the the stream or the river to go to not flood and be able to use a place that maybe is no longer where it's no longer possible for the river to use the floodplain. I mean, would that be regulated, or would that? I guess
Sometimes,
yeah,
I
'cause
mean,
you might have
depending
to
on the location of it, it might, you might have like historic preservation wanting to take a look to see if it's a risky area for cultural resources. You might want to have wetlands, make sure if you're bringing heavy vehicles in that it's not impacting an adjacent or nearby wetland. So again, there's sort of some hand holding, just who these folks should talk to, or if you're interested, like who you'd want to talk to at the state to just make sure and find out first what may or may not need like an okay or a permanent approval.
So this
Yeah,
would be
Kat.
yeah. So this would be important for towns to engage in.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Thank
It
you.
looks like Todd had his hand up, and Kathy, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond a little bit to Darlene's question, which is, all of the projects that CRC does are working with, essentially they're voluntary projects. We're working with landowners that want to do some sort of project, whether that is, restore a floodplain or put trees in, or, is the landowner who's going to take a dam out. In all cases, as the project partner, we're the one who is helping to navigate, the permits needed, who needs to be checked with, how to identify the funding and identifying the grants and pursuing them. So, Darlene, I think that kind of the answer to your question is for the non-regulated, non-required projects, groups like us, the regional planning commissions, the local conservation districts, we are the ones that can actually work with landowners, if you know them, to implement a project, identify the funding, and do all of the project management work to get it done.
Thanks,
Great.
Kathy.
Thank you.
And we're approaching 1, so Todd, your question will have to be the last question.
I agree. Great question, Darlene. So comments, advice, I guess. First off, there's no requirement in Vermont when you transfer a property to have a boundary survey. The end result is most people don't know where their boundaries are. The town tax maps are notoriously unreliable, and our A&R Atlas platform, it pulls out those digitized, it's a map layer, the digital town tax maps. So you can look at it, but you can't trust it. I can tell you this personally here. We've got a piece of property that we don't even own. I don't know how that got changed. I'm trying to get that resolved. Don't ever let anybody tell you, oh, don't worry, you don't need permits. You need to ask the people that has been discussed here by other people, that ask the question early. And there's different ways to go about it, but if you say, oh, we don't need any permits, and you are flagged to the Environmental Enforcement Division, I can advise you, don't go there. Hope that helps.
Thanks for your addition, Todd. I'm going to put a feedback survey in the chat really quick, and then we're going to wrap up. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and for everybody from the partners sharing all of the amazing work that you do. This was an amazing session, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for the great talk. Have a good one.